By 1915, the war had become unmistakably modern. Steel rained down in quantities no battlefield had ever seen before. Machine guns turned open ground into killing zones measured in seconds. New weapons appeared with almost unsettling speed, designed in factories, refined by engineers, and deployed faster than anyone fully understood their consequences. And yet, much of the thinking behind the war had not changed. Generals still spoke the language of courage and momentum. Plans still assumed that enough willpower, applied decisively, could break an enemy line. Orders still sent men forward in formations better suited to a different century. The result was not innovation keeping pace with violence. It was violence outpacing imagination. Across the fronts, armies fielded weapons capable of killing at industrial scale, while clinging to doctrines built for smaller wars. Firepower grew more lethal, protection lagged behind. Adaptation came slowly, often only after catastrophe forced it. This mismatch defined the middle years of World War I. New tools arrived with promises of breakthrough artillery barrages meant to pulverize defenses, gas clouds meant to terrorize and incapacitate, submarines meant to strangle entire economies at sea. But each innovation brought unintended consequences. And each failure reinforced a dangerous belief that the next weapon, used just a little more aggressively, would finally end the stalemate. It wouldn't. Instead, the war grew deadlier and longer. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 6. In this episode, we'll look at how technology transformed the battlefield between 1915 and 1916, and why those transformations did not bring the decisive victories many expected. We'll start with the weapons that dominated the land war, artillery and machine guns, and how their sheer destructive power reshaped every battlefield they touched. Then, we'll slow down for a major deep dive into the first large-scale gas attack near Ypres in western Belgium, a moment when innovation crossed a moral threshold and introduced a new kind of fear to the war. From there, we'll turn to the sea, where submarines threatened global trade and dragged neutral powers closer to the conflict. And finally, we'll examine why, despite all this innovation, tactics lagged behind, and how old assumptions, stubbornly applied, turned new weapons into instruments of prolonged failure. This was a war becoming more modern by the month, while still being fought with ideas that belonged to the past. By the middle of 1915, it had become clear what truly dominated the battlefield. Not courage, not maneuver, firepower. Artillery was responsible for the majority of casualties in World War I, and its role expanded rapidly as the war settled into stalemate. Before the war, artillery had been important but limited by logistics and doctrine. During the war, industrial production transformed it into the central instrument of combat. Shells were produced in the millions, guns grew larger, more accurate, and more numerous. Entire offensives were planned around artillery barrages designed to destroy enemy defenses before infantry ever moved. The battlefield changed accordingly. Ground that had once been fields or forests was churned into a cratered landscape where orientation became difficult and movement hazardous. Trenches collapsed under bombardment, roads vanished, landmarks disappeared. Men fought in environments that barely resembled geography at all. Artillery did not just kill, it reshaped space, and it reshaped time. Shelling could last for hours, days, or even weeks before an attack, creating a psychological environment where anticipation was often worse than impact. Men learned to listen for the sound of incoming fire, to judge distance by tone, to distinguish between shells meant to destroy and shells meant to harass. A British soldier wrote, "The guns never seem to stop. Even when they do, you wait for them to begin again. Silence feels like a trick." Machine guns completed this transformation. Before the war, machine guns were already known quantities, but their impact had been underestimated. Many armies viewed them as support weapons rather than battlefield anchors. That assumption did not survive first contact. A single well-positioned machine gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute and dominate open ground. When paired with overlapping fields of fire and supported by artillery, machine guns turned offense into exposure. This mattered because doctrine lagged behind reality. Infantry tactics still emphasized advance, cohesion, and visible momentum. Attacks were planned as linear movements across open ground, assuming that suppression would be temporary and resistance localized. Instead, advancing soldiers encountered layered defenses designed to absorb and destroy movement. The result was slaughter. What made this especially destructive was the interaction between artillery and machine guns. Artillery forced troops out of cover or collapsed trenches, while machine guns waited to exploit any movement that followed. When attacks failed, artillery often intensified, creating a cycle where destruction increased without changing outcomes. Firepower fed stalemate, and stalemate fed firepower. As attacks stalled, commanders sought solutions in volume rather than revision. More shells, longer barrages, denser concentrations of fire. Each escalation assumed that destruction alone could produce decision. This belief proved remarkably persistent. One reason was institutional. Artillery was measurable, shells could be counted, guns could be deployed, barrage plans could be drawn on maps and timetables. Compared to the uncertainty of maneuver, artillery offered the comfort of calculation. Another reason was political. Artillery symbolized effort. It demonstrated commitment. A massive bombardment could be pointed to as proof that something was being done, even when results were minimal. But the battlefield told a different story. The more intense the bombardment, the more terrain became impassable. Craters filled with water, debris tangled movement, destroyed trenches offered no shelter to attackers once they advanced. Firepower was winning ground, and then making that ground impossible to occupy. Machine guns ensured that any delay was punished immediately. Soldiers emerging from shell holes or climbing out of trenches became targets the moment they were visible. Survival often depended not on bravery, but on timing and luck. This had a profound psychological effect. Men learned that personal courage mattered less than circumstance. That skill could be overwhelmed by randomness. That survival was often a matter of whether a shell landed 10 yards closer or farther. The war became impersonal, not because men stopped caring, but because the mechanisms of killing were increasingly detached from individual intent. Commanders were not blind to this. Reports described catastrophic losses. Officers observed attacks fail repeatedly. But adaptation was slow, partly because alternatives were unclear, and partly because admitting failure threatened institutional credibility. So the war continued forward, powered by weapons that made success harder the more they were used. By 1916, artillery and machine guns had not broken the stalemate. They had entrenched it. They forced armies to rethink everything: how attacks were planned, how defenses were constructed, how soldiers lived and fought, but that rethinking lagged behind necessity. This gap between capability and understanding defined the middle years of the war. Weapons evolved rapidly. Thinking did not. And into that gap stepped new ideas, new experiments, and new horrors. One of them would arrive quietly, carried not by shells or bullets, but by the wind. By the spring of 1915, the war had reached a strange point. Everyone knew the fighting could not continue the way it had begun, and yet no one knew how to change it. That uncertainty did not stop experimentation. In Germany, scientists and military planners had begun asking a dangerous question. If artillery and machine guns could not break the stalemate on their own, what else might? One of the central figures in this effort was Fritz Haber, a German chemist and Nobel laureate, celebrated for his work on industrial ammonia synthesis, a process that helped feed millions by enabling artificial fertilizer production. Haber believed that science should serve the state in wartime as fully as it did in peace. To him, chemical weapons were not barbarism. They were efficiency. If a weapon could incapacitate enemy troops quickly and decisively, reducing the need for prolonged bombardment and mass infantry attacks, then in his reasoning, it might actually shorten the war. This logic was not unique to Haber. It was shared by military planners desperate for a breakthrough, and by scientists who saw war as a proving ground for applied knowledge. Ethical concerns were discussed, but they were weighed against necessity, urgency, and national survival. Chlorine gas emerged as the first candidate. It was readily available as an industrial chemical. It was heavier than air, meaning it would sink into trenches rather than dissipate upward. And it attacked the lungs violently, causing panic and collapse. But chlorine had a flaw. It depended entirely on the wind. Release it at the wrong moment, and it could drift back toward your own lines. This made the weapon both terrifying and unreliable. Which brings us to the 22nd of April, 1915, near Ypres in western Belgium. On this stretch of the front, French colonial troops, including Algerian and Moroccan units and Canadian forces, held positions opposite German lines. The terrain was already scarred by months of fighting. Trenches were shallow, dugouts crude. That afternoon, German troops quietly opened thousands of cylinders embedded in their frontline trenches. A light breeze carried the gas forward. At first, Allied soldiers saw a strange cloud forming yellow-green, rolling low along the ground. Some thought it was smoke meant to conceal movement. Others assumed it was a new kind of artillery effect. No one recognized it immediately as poison. A Canadian medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, later wrote of the confusion spreading along the line. Men were puzzled at first. It looked like fog, but it burned the eyes and chest. Then the coughing began, and we knew this was something different. As the gas reached the trenches, confusion turned to terror. Chlorine reacts with moisture in the lungs, forming corrosive acids. Breathing becomes agony. Chest tightens. Vision blurs. Men gagged, collapsed, clawed at their throats. Some fled instinctively, climbing out of trenches only to find the gas thicker near the ground. Others remained frozen, unsure whether to move or stay. Entire sections of the line ceased to function. Within hours, roughly 6,000 Allied soldiers were killed or incapacitated, with over 1,000 dead almost immediately. Units dissolved not because they broke discipline, but because their bodies failed them. Gaps opened in the line. From a tactical standpoint, this was the moment German planners had been waiting for. But something unexpected happened. German infantry hesitated. They had been warned that chlorine was dangerous. They did not know how long it lingered. They feared advancing into their own weapon. Some officers worried that the gas had not fully cleared. Others feared a wind shift. So they waited. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. By the time German units advanced cautiously, Allied forces were already improvising. Canadian troops rushed forward to plug gaps. Men soaked cloths in water, then in urine, after realizing ammonia could blunt the gas's effects. Orders spread by shouting, not doctrine. The line bent. It did not break. This hesitation matters. It reveals the central paradox of new weapons in this war. Innovation created opportunity and uncertainty. The very novelty that made gas terrifying also made it difficult to exploit decisively. Psychologically, however, the damage was done. Gas changed how soldiers understood the battlefield. Shells could be heard. Bullets could be avoided with cover. Gas arrived silently, invisibly, and without clear boundaries. It turned air itself into an enemy. A French soldier later recalled, "There was nothing to fight. The gas was everywhere. You breathed, and it punished you." Within days, word spread rapidly along the front. Stories grew darker with retelling. Men spoke of lungs destroyed without wounds, of bodies found untouched but lifeless. Fear traveled faster than chlorine ever could. Commanders responded quickly. Improvised protective measures became standard. Soldiers were ordered to keep cloths ready at all times. Crude masks followed, then more advanced respirators. Training incorporated gas alarms and drills. And just as importantly, the Allies began developing their own chemical weapons. What had begun as a German experiment became an arms race. By late 1915, chlorine gave way to phosgene, which was deadlier and harder to detect. Later came mustard gas, which burned skin and eyes and lingered in terrain for days. Each new gas addressed the limitation of the last. Each escalation made the battlefield more hostile. Over the course of the war, more than 1 million soldiers would be affected by gas, with roughly 90,000 deaths attributed directly to chemical weapons. Many survivors suffered permanent lung damage, blindness, or chronic illness. And yet, for all this suffering, gas never delivered strategic victory. It terrified, it disrupted, it maimed, but it did not end stalemate. Gas joined artillery and machine guns as another layer of danger absorbed into a system already defined by endurance rather than decision. What the first gas attack at Ypres truly changed was not the outcome of a battle, but the boundaries of war itself. Scientists had crossed the line. Not because they were uniquely cruel, but because they believed that knowledge could force an outcome where strategy had failed. Once that line was crossed, it could not be uncrossed. War became not only industrial, but experimental. And the men in the trenches became unwilling participants in that experiment. In the years that followed, chemical weapons would come to occupy a strange place in the memory of the war. They were not the deadliest weapons on the battlefield. Artillery killed far more. Machine guns accounted for more bodies. And yet, gas came to symbolize something uniquely disturbing about World War I. It felt different. Chemical weapons attacked the most basic human act, breathing, and did so invisibly, unpredictably, and often long after the moment of exposure. Survivors carried the war inside their bodies for years, sometimes for life, with damaged lungs, impaired vision, and chronic illness that never fully healed. After the war, veterans spoke of gas with particular bitterness. Not because it was worse in every measurable way, but because it felt like a betrayal of an unspoken rule. Even in industrial war, there had been assumptions about how violence would be delivered, about what kinds of suffering were expected. Gas violated those assumptions. That reaction mattered. In the aftermath of World War I, chemical weapons became the focus of international revulsion in a way few other weapons did. Diplomatic efforts moved quickly to prohibit their use. By 1925, the Geneva Protocol formally banned chemical and biological weapons in warfare, declaring them unacceptable under international law. The ban did not mean the weapons disappeared. Stockpiles remained. Research continued quietly. Governments hedged, preparing for the possibility that the rules might be broken again. But the line had been drawn. Chemical weapons were now recognized as something different, not merely another tool of war, but a category of violence that carried moral weight beyond its battlefield utility. That distinction is telling. World War I did not make the world more humane, but it did force societies to confront the consequences of unrestrained innovation. Some weapons once used demanded limits not because they were uniquely effective, but because they revealed how far war could go if nothing was held back. We'll return to that question later when the war ends and the world tries to decide what lessons it has actually learned. Because banning a weapon is easier than understanding why it felt necessary to build it in the first place. While the land war was being transformed by artillery, machine guns, and gas, a quieter revolution was unfolding at sea. It did not announce itself with barrages or clouds. It arrived without warning. Submarines were not new in 1914, but before the war, they were largely experimental curiosities rather than decisive weapons. Naval doctrine still revolved around surface fleets, battleships, and the idea that sea power would be decided in a single climactic engagement. That assumption would not survive contact with reality. Germany entered the war at a naval disadvantage. The British Royal Navy was larger, more experienced, and capable of enforcing a global blockade. Direct confrontation risked catastrophic defeat. Submarines offered an alternative asymmetric, indirect, and difficult to counter. Much like gas on land, submarines promised a way around stalemate. Rather than breaking the enemy's military directly, they aimed to strangle the systems that sustained it. Merchant ships carried food, fuel, and raw materials. Sink enough of them, and economies would falter. Civilian morale would suffer. Pressure would build far from the front lines. The logic was brutally simple. The execution was anything but. Early submarines were cramped, unreliable, and dangerous even to their crews. Visibility was limited. Torpedoes often malfunctioned, surfacing to identify ships, exposed boats to attack. And yet, their very invisibility made them terrifying. Unlike artillery, which announced itself loudly, or gas, which could sometimes be seen drifting in, submarines erased the boundary between civilian and battlefield. A merchant sailor might see nothing until an explosion tore through the hull. This psychological effect mattered as much as the physical damage. Much like gas warfare, submarines attacked something previously assumed to be neutral or safe. The sea had always been dangerous, but it had not been indiscriminate in this way. Warships fought warships. Civilians moved at the edges. Submarines collapsed that distinction. Germany initially attempted to follow established prize rules, surfacing, warning ships, allowing crews to abandon vessel before sinking it, but this quickly proved impractical. Merchant ships could ram submarines. Radio calls could summon patrols. Delay increased risk. So the rules bent. Then they broke. By 1915, Germany began experimenting with unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships without warning in designated zones around the British Isles. The effect was immediate. Shipping losses rose, insurance rates soared, neutral governments protested. British civilians began to feel the war not as distant reports, but as shortages, rationing, and fear. As with artillery barrages on land, the response to failure was escalation. Sink more ships, expand patrol areas, apply pressure faster. But submarines shared a limitation with other new technologies we've discussed. They disrupted systems. They terrified populations. They inflicted suffering. They did not, on their own, deliver decisive victory. British countermeasures improved. Convoys reduced losses. Detection methods evolved. And once again, innovation triggered adaptation rather than collapse. There is a familiar pattern here. Artillery promised to pulverize defenses, but created terrain that favored defense instead. Gas promised to incapacitate en masse, but became another layer of danger absorbed into stalemate. Submarines promised to bypass armies entirely, but forced opponents to reorganize rather than surrender. Each new technology attacked a vulnerability. Each revealed another. What submarines did succeed in doing was expanding the war's scope. They internationalized it. Neutral ships were sunk. Neutral citizens killed. Governments that had hoped to remain distant were forced to respond. And just as gas warfare provoked legal and moral backlash, submarine warfare raised urgent questions about the rules of war. Who was a combatant? What counted as a legitimate target? Could economic survival justify civilian risk? These questions did not have easy answers. German leaders believed they were fighting a war of survival against a blockade designed to starve them into submission. British leaders viewed submarine attacks as barbaric violations of long-standing maritime norms. Neutral powers saw their sovereignty challenged. Once again, everyone believed their position was defensive. And once again, escalation followed. The submarine war demonstrated something essential about modern conflict. Technological innovation did not replace political decision-making. It intensified it. Every torpedo fired carried diplomatic consequences. Every sinking rippled outward, affecting alliances, neutral opinion, and future escalation. Submarines, like gas, exposed a gap between what technology made possible and what law, ethics, and strategy were prepared to manage. They were weapons designed faster than the systems meant to constrain them. By the middle years of the war, the sea was no longer a separate theater. It was part of the same story unfolding on land, a story where innovation arrived faster than understanding, and where each attempt to force a solution deepened the conflict instead. And just as on land, the question was no longer whether new weapons could be built, but whether anyone truly knew how to use them without making the war larger, longer, and harder to end. Somewhere far from the trenches, the war looked very different. In offices, laboratories, and workshops across Europe, engineers and scientists studied diagrams rather than terrain, formulas rather than mud. They worked with controlled variables, predictable outcomes, and the belief that problems, even military ones, could be solved with enough precision. One such figure was Ernst Junger, not yet the writer he would later become, but an educated young officer deeply interested in technology, organization, and the mechanics of war. While not a designer in the strict industrial sense, Junger embodied a broader mindset shared by engineers, planners, and innovators across the conflict. The war, from this perspective, was a system. If a weapon failed, it could be improved. If an attack stalled, the solution lay in refinement, better coordination, stronger materials, more firepower applied with greater exactness. This belief drove innovation at an extraordinary pace. New artillery calibers were tested, machine gun mounts refined, gas delivery systems adjusted, submarine engines improved. Each iteration promised to fix the problems exposed by the last. On paper, the logic was sound. On the battlefield, it unraveled. Designers imagined weapons operating in ideal conditions: flat ground, clear sightlines, predictable resistance. The front lines offered none of these: mud-clogged mechanisms. Explosions reshaped terrain, weather disrupted timing, human exhaustion introduced variables no equation could account for. A shell designed to destroy trenches might instead collapse them, burying defenders, but also eliminating usable cover for attackers. A gas cloud calculated to drift forward might stall, disperse, or reverse direction. A machine gun optimized for sustained fire might overheat within minutes under real conditions. The gap between design, intent, and battlefield reality widened steadily. One artillery officer wrote after an aborted offensive, "Everything worked as planned except the enemy, the ground, and the men. This disconnect was not due to incompetence. It was structural." Weapons were designed to solve discrete problems, while war presented interconnected ones. Fixing one vulnerability often created another. Increasing firepower reduced mobility. Improving protection slowed advance. Precision demanded conditions that chaos denied. And yet, the solution offered by institutions was almost always the same. More. More shells, more guns, more innovation. The war rewarded production over reflection. Factories expanded faster than doctrine evolved. Engineers were promoted for efficiency, not restraint. Success was measured in output rather than outcomes. This created a feedback loop. Battlefield failure prompted new designs. New designs encouraged new offensives. Those offensives revealed fresh failures, which justified further innovation. Rarely did anyone stop to ask whether the underlying assumptions were flawed. The designer imagined a breakthrough. The soldier experienced a cycle. This divide had psychological consequences as well. Men at the front began to view new weapons with skepticism rather than hope. Innovation no longer meant relief, it meant adaptation to another danger. Each announcement of a solution was greeted not with optimism, but with resignation. One infantryman wrote home, "They tell us this new thing will change everything. That is what they said last time too." Even those committed to technological progress sensed the limits of their approach. Late in the war, Junger would reflect that machinery had not made war cleaner or more rational, but more abstract, distancing those who designed it from those who endured it. The battlefield was not a laboratory. It was an ecosystem of fear, exhaustion, weather, terrain, and chance. No blueprint could capture that fully. This tension between intention and experience defined the middle years of the war. It explains why new weapons arrived faster than new ideas and why innovation so often deepened stalemate instead of ending it. The tragedy was not that technology failed. It was that it worked exactly as designed in a world that refused to behave as expected. By 1916, something uncomfortable had become impossible to ignore. The war was not failing because armies lacked weapons. They had weapons in abundance. What they lacked was a way to use them that matched reality. Again and again, commanders returned to familiar ideas, decisive offensives, concentrated blows, breakthroughs achieved through will and pressure. These concepts had worked in earlier wars, and they remained deeply embedded in military culture. To abandon them felt not just risky, but irresponsible, so they were reinforced instead. More artillery would soften defenses, longer barrages would destroy resistance, new weapons would finally tip the balance. When attacks failed, the conclusion was rarely that the idea itself was flawed. It was that execution had been insufficient. This mindset produced a pattern that repeated across fronts. Plans emphasized preparation rather than flexibility. Attacks were timed precisely, mapped carefully, and launched according to schedule even when conditions on the ground had changed. Once an offensive began, momentum mattered more than reassessment. The result was predictability. Defenders learned when and where attacks were coming. Artillery warned them. Gas announced itself with alarms. Submarines revealed intent through patterns of patrol. Surprise became harder to achieve, not because attackers lacked creativity, but because systems demanded order. And order, in modern war, was visible. At the tactical level, soldiers adapted faster than institutions. Men learned to disperse, to dig deeper, to exploit terrain instinctively. They stopped advancing in neat formations and started moving in short, desperate bursts. They listened for subtle cues, changes in shelling, shifts in wind, unusual silence. But these adaptations were local. Doctrine moved slowly. Military organizations were built to preserve continuity, not experimentation. Promotion rewarded adherence to established methods. Failure could be explained. Deviation was harder to defend. This created a dangerous gap. Weapons evolved rapidly. Tactics did not. Gas demanded new responses, but commanders initially treated it as an extension of artillery rather than a fundamentally different threat. Machine guns required dispersion and coordination, but attacks still emphasized mass. Artillery shattered ground, yet assaults assumed that shattered ground could be crossed on schedule. Submarines disrupted economies, but leaders struggled to integrate naval pressure into coherent political strategy. Everywhere, innovation outran integration. This was not stupidity. It was inertia. War had become too complex to be reshaped quickly, and too destructive to pause for reflection. Decisions were made under pressure, filtered through institutions designed for earlier conflicts, and justified by fear of appearing passive. And so, the war continued forward, propelled by habit as much as intent. The tragedy is that the evidence was visible. Reports described failure clearly. Casualty figures mounted. Soldiers wrote home expressing disbelief that the same methods were being tried again. But the alternatives were uncertain. To admit that the old ways no longer worked was to admit that no clear path forward existed. And uncertainty was more frightening than loss. So armies chose the familiar, even when it no longer made sense. This is the core paradox of new weapons and old thinking. Innovation increased the capacity for destruction, but without corresponding change in doctrine, it also increased the cost of learning. By the end of 1916, it was no longer enough to build better weapons. The war demanded new ways of thinking. That transformation would come slowly, unevenly, and under terrible pressure. But before it did, Millions more would be sent forward under assumptions that had already failed. In this episode, we watch the war change shape, not because leaders planned it that way, but because technology moved faster than understanding. We saw how artillery and machine guns came to dominate the battlefield, reshaping land, time, and expectation, and turning movement itself into a liability. Firepower no longer supported tactics, it dictated them, often trapping armies in positions they could neither abandon nor escape. We followed the introduction of chemical weapons at Ypres, where science crossed a line in search of efficiency and instead introduced a new kind of fear. Gas did not break the stalemate, but it altered the moral landscape of the war, forcing soldiers and societies alike to confront what modern conflict was becoming. At sea, submarines carried the same logic into a new domain, invisible, disruptive, and difficult to contain. They expanded the battlefield beyond trenches and front lines, dragging civilians, neutral states, and global trade directly into the conflict. And through the lens of the weapons designer, we saw the growing gap between intention and experience, between carefully engineered solutions and the chaotic reality of mud, weather, exhaustion, and chance. Taken together, these stories point to a single conclusion. World War I was not being prolonged by a lack of ingenuity. It was being prolonged by the mismatch between innovation and adaptation. New weapons arrived with the promise of decision, but without new thinking, they became tools of endurance rather than resolution. Institutions clung to familiar assumptions because abandoning them meant stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty felt more dangerous than continued loss. By 1916, the war had become something its architects never intended: more lethal, more complex, and increasingly difficult to control. In the next episode, we'll turn away from weapons and battlefields and focus instead on the societies fighting this war. We'll explore how the demands of total war reshaped civilian life, how governments mobilized entire populations, and how the home front became inseparable from the front lines themselves. Because as the fighting dragged on, it was no longer just armies under strain. It was nations. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.